All right, this is accurately handling the word of truth. Again, it's a study in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. We're studying tonight 1 Corinthians 14, 10 through 14. We'll see how far we get with that. Verse 10, just right up here on the screen, says, "There are, it may be, so many kinds of voices in the world, and none of them is without signification." Now, to give just a bit of background review, is that Paul has started with verse 7 to provide some analogies and some teaching about what speaking in tongues can do and what speaking in tongues cannot do, because the Corinthians have requested that he come and speak to them in tongues, which causes him to realize that he needs to do some basic teaching about speaking in tongues. And so he gave an analogy. The first one that he gave had to do with sounds, inanimate noisemakers, music makers that just blew only one note over and over and over again, and that was not beneficial to the hearers. And he said, you are like that when you speak with tongues without an interpretation. It is simply monotonous, unhelpful, and unpleasant. So now we're starting in on his second analogy that he is doing to try to get them to understand what this grace gift of speaking in tongues can do and what it can't do. And this is the setup verse. It's his setup for an analogy that he's going to present in verse 11. And basically, all he's saying in this verse here is voices in this particular verse is phone, and it means languages. So he's gone from sounds in verse 8 to words in verse 9, and now in verse 10 he is going to the next step. He's zeroing in on his point that he's trying to make about speaking in tongues, is that now he is saying that languages, there are, it may be, so many kinds of languages in the world, and none of them is without signification. Signification is just a big King James word that just simply means meaning, understandableness. And so basically what he's saying is that there are many languages in the world, and they all mean something to somebody, but that does not mean that they mean something to everybody. It means that they're not without meaning to somebody, but they surely will be without meaning to people that don't know that particular language. And of course, now this is the setup for verse 11, which says this. It says, therefore. And therefore means, what's the therefore? It's because languages have meaning to somebody. All languages do, but they don't have a meaning to everybody. Therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice or the language, now, I need to, voice is the same word as significant, or the word meaning in therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice, the word meaning there is exactly the same word as is used in verse 10, where the translators say without signification. None of them is without signification. is the word for meaning. It means without meaning. None of them are without meaning. Now, when he gets to verse 11, the translators turn around and say, therefore, if I know not the meaning of the language, but the word is the same. Therefore, I know not the signification of the language. I don't know why they use two different words for the same Greek word in two different places. It's just one of those mysteries. If I know not the meaning of the language, I shall be unto him. And remember last time I said that there was going to be an analogy of two barbarians. And here we've got the two barbarians. And I think somebody could make a great skit out of this thing because it's pretty humorous here. Here you've got it says, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me. Now, the word barbarian is actually a Greek word. The Greek word is barbaros, and it's a Greek word, and because Greeks were very, very egocentric, they thought that the world revolved around their culture, their language, that they were superior in their language, in their technology, in their culture, in their philosophy, that they were superior, and that if you did not know Greek, everybody in the whole world was called a barbaros, a barbarian. So they considered the Jews to be barbarians if they didn't know Greek. If they weren't fluent in Greek, and they would consider an Egyptian, and Egyptian technology and their advances and all those things, Greeks considered them to be barbarians if they didn't know Greek. So what's happening here is you've got one guy that's speaking a language that is perfectly legitimate, but it is not Greek, and he is considered to be a barbarian. However, you take that very same barbarian and you say, okay, you don't understand Greek, I'm going to speak Greek to you anyway. Kind of like Americans say, hey, you got to learn English. You got to learn English. You know, I'm not learning your language. You got to learn mine. And this is what this is the egocentricities and arrogance that was of the Greeks, but it's also very common today. You speak English, otherwise you will not be able to do commerce. And that is the truth right now, is that the reason why the world speaks English is not because English is a superior language. It's because that's the way you can make money. And all the world wants to make money, so, hey, they got to learn English. It's just the way it is. But if I speak English to someone who doesn't speak English, guess what I sound like to him? A barbarian. So he sounds like a barbarian to me. I sound like a barbarian to him. And I want to give you a good example. I grew up in a third world country, and what would happen is that we would be out amongst the Ethiopian street kids, and they would follow us around, and they would be doing this because they thought, hey, I'm gonna sound like an American. I'm going to sound like, they didn't know English. They definitely didn't know American style English. And they would follow us along, and they would be going, nanner, 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 nanner. They would be following us along, thinking that they were sounding like an American. Because to them, English sounded like this. Neener, 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 neener. That's what English sounded like to them. I was a barbarian when I spoke English. It went neener, neener. It was the same repetition over and over again. The Greeks did the same thing with the word barbarian, because barbaros, it simply is a word that means that every other language sounded like bar, 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 bar to them. And that's what each of them, because they didn't know each other's language, sounded like bar, 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 or neener, 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 neener. Did you realize, Americans, that that's what you sound like to the untrained ear of anybody who doesn't speak English? Neener, 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 because the street kids of Ethiopia told me that's what it sounded like. Guess what? Speaking with tongues sounds like the same syllables being repeated over and over and over again to those, to everybody. And that's what it says. It says barbarians sound like barbarians, or people sound like barbarians if you don't understand what the meaning is. And of course, when speaking with tongues is done, it is the repetition of sounds that do not, they're not helpful, and it's quite annoying in a lot of ways. I have a very sophisticated, very good friend who happened to be my building principal. Well, when I was a teacher, he was my principal for 15 years. Eloquent, articulate, sophisticated, just a really smart guy. Well, when he got baptized in the Holy Spirit, guess what he got as far as his speaking in tongues? He only got 2 syllables. He didn't get this full language like Spanish or something like that. He got tiki. That's all he got. Tiki. Now, here's a real intelligent guy, very sophisticated, got a PhD, is responsible for a lot of people, very, very dignified man. He's got a choice. Does he go tiki, 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 tiki? Or does he say, this is really stupid? Well, in his case, he decided, of course, he wasn't going to be on a street corner or have a microphone when he did this, but he decided he was just going to keep on in his own private prayer time going tiki, 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 tiki. You know what? He did tiki, 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 tiki for about 3 years before he got anything else. How many of you would do tiki, 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 or bar, 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 or neener, 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 neener for that long because you really wanted to commune with God? There aren't that many. Most people are low bidders when it comes to this. And they say, yes, I would really love to speak in tongues, but I can't. Or is it, I really don't want to that much? I'll leave that question up in the air there. It's strange but true that the Corinthians believed that speaking the same syllables over and over again while speaking with tongues would impress the hearers so much that they would have to acknowledge that the tongue speaker that were more spiritual than others. And I didn't just pull that out of my hat. By the time we get to verse 21 and 22 in this chapter, you will see that this is in fact what they thought. They thought that speaking in tongues was going to be a sign of superior spirituality, and it would be the indicator of who was close to God and who wasn't close to God. All without interpretation. No interpretation, because they didn't care whether it was interpreted or not. All right, so that's what we've got there, is that because the Corinthians in their culture, the Greco-Roman culture, and I've talked about this early on in this study, is that they emphasized, we at least in part in our culture think that you've got to, unless you've been listening to the presidential debates, it all breaks down here, because for the most part we pride ourselves on the fact that when somebody speaks, it's the content of what you say that's the most important. Okay? But like I said, with our presidential debates, what it is that we're far more Corinthian than we think we are, because Corinthians didn't think that the content of what you said was that important. You know what they thought was important? The style in which you said it. Your stage presence. The tone of voice that you used. The cadence in which you spoke. Those were the things that were important to them. It was only secondarily that they wanted to have some content. In fact, the orators of the first century in Corinth were kind of like the rock stars at that time, and they could make a good living by going around and just speaking as a way of entertaining the crowds. And they could earn a lot of money that way. And they would have subjects like they would enumerate the qualities of a flea. I'm not kidding. That was a subject to be orated on. Or the embarrassing qualities of a bald head. And they could make a lot of money doing this stuff because it had nothing to do with the content. It had to do with the style. It had to do with the panache in which you spoke. That's what was important to the Corinthians. And they took that same thing into their Christianity and said, it doesn't matter the content of speaking in tongues. What matters is that you do it with style and with flash and with a lot of drama and an inflection. And that's what we've got a lot of times when it comes to our debates as well in our modern day. Now, before I go on there, the edification of the hearers is Paul's priority, But the entertainment value of the hearers is the Corinthians' priority. They wanted to sound impressive. Paul didn't want to sound impressive. He wanted the content of what he had to say to be edifying, not impressive. In fact, he was criticized by the Corinthians to the point where they said his speech is contemptible. Why? Because he did not speak for the impression that it made on people. He only spoke to give them content that would edify them. And remember what edify means. It means to motivate people to draw closer, to have a continuous and clean and close connection with Jesus Christ. And that's the reason why Paul spoke, but the Corinthians said, no, that's not the reason why we speak, and that's not the reason why you should speak either. We don't think you're an apostle. Therefore, okay, so let's go on to verse 12. Even so you. So he's got this analogy where he's got these two barbarians trying to talk to each other, and they both sound like idiots to each other. And look at what he says. He gets just about as blunt as you can get. He says, even so you. And my opinion is that there should be a period after ye. Even so ye. Period. That he isn't talking so much about their being zealous for spiritual gifts. He's saying you are like a bunch of barbarians trying to impress each other with your language, and everybody concludes that everybody else is an idiot. And that's what speaking with tongues in a public gathering without interpretation produces. And that's the point that Paul is trying to make. He's saying barbarians don't understand each other. And that is exactly what you're like when you speak in tongues. Even so you. That's the way you are. Now, the new sentence starts with, it should have, in my opinion, the new sentence should start with for. Capital F, for. For as much as you are zealous of spiritual gifts, that's a new thought. The even so ye should be part of the analogy of the barbarians. You are barbarians when you speak with tongues. The new idea that he brings out should start with for. For as much as you are zealous of spiritual gifts, seek that ye may excel to the edifying of the church. That's the new thought. The new thought is you are zealous of spiritual gifts. For as much as, if I look that up and I find out what the Greek is, for as much as is just a long King James way of saying since you are zealous of spiritual gifts. Now there's some things that need to be done here with this sentence. He's saying, since you are zealous for spiritual gifts, you should excel to edifying the church. But you're not edifying the church, you're entertaining the church. Or you think you're impressing the church with this barbarian repetition of syllables. It's just not working. And he'll describe more of that later on. He'll keep drilling down on this thing. But the first thing that needs to be pointed out is that the word is not zealous in Greek. Now, Paul has used the word zealous several times already, but this is not one of the places where he uses the word zealous. He says, you are, and he uses a noun. Zealous is an adjective. It means it describes that you are warmly interested. But he doesn't use the adjective zealous. He uses the noun zealot. Since you are zealots, and you know what a zealot is, don't you? In case you don't know what a zealot is, it's somebody who's fanatically interested in something. So what basically Paul is saying, he's saying, since you are fanatically interested in, then the next word is spiritual gifts, but the word gifts is not there. The word gifts needs to be ignored, just like in many other places within these chapters, where gifts is just kind of thrown in there for free and for no linguistic reason at all. It says you are fanatically interested in, and the word is not spiritual there. It simply is the word spirits. Spirits. The powers that are behind paranormal phenomena. That's what the word is there. The power that is operating behind paranormal phenomena. You are fanatics. You are so zealously fanatical about the spirits behind miraculous phenomena. Now, the thing is that they were fanatically interested in the spiritual powers that lie and accompany all kinds of spiritual manifestations. They were not necessarily only fanatical about manifestations that originated with the Holy Spirit. Remember, way back at the beginning of chapter 12, it talked about the fact that they were carried away, fanatically carried away by the powers that were behind lethal curses. People actually could die of those because there was an actual spiritual power behind it, and they were fanatically carried away by those kinds of phenomena. They didn't care necessarily whether it originated with the Holy Spirit or whether it originated with evil spirits, because Paul uses the word spirits in both ways, and you got to understand what the context is in order to be able to understand if he's talking about evil spirits or if he's talking about things that originate from the one and only Holy Spirit along the way. So, seek that ye may excel. Excel is the same word to be fanatically interested. If you are fanatics for spiritual phenomena, seek that you might be fanatical to the edifying of the church. But the thing about it is that he's been after them on is that they didn't care whether they edified the church or not. What they cared about is identifying who's spiritually superior and who's spiritually inferior. And they believed that speaking in tongues could identify those that were and those that weren't. So what he's saying is take that zeal, take that fanaticism that you have about spiritual powers and channel it and funnel it into edifying the church. In other words, channel all that fanatical zeal that you've got into getting a direct, continuous, and clean connection to Christ. And motivating other people to do the same thing. Okay, and remember when it says edifying the church here, Paul is only talking about a narrow kind of church. He's not talking about the worldwide church, and he's not talking about where two or three are gathered. He's talking about an open, come one, come all, public assembly, regardless of the relationship with Christ or the level of spiritual understanding. So he's saying, get this preoccupation with spirits and funnel it into bringing whoever shows up in your meetings closer to Christ. That's what he's actually saying in that verse there. All right, we're continuing on here. Better check my notes here. See if we've gotten... All right, verse 13. Wherefore, and what's the wherefore, therefore? These are questions that guys like me ask, that other people just kind of blow right through. They just think, well, it's just a Christian fill-in. It's just a blah, blah, blah. It's a bar, 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 bar. Ticky, 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 ticky. Neener, 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 neener. And nobody asks what's the wherefore, therefore. Wherefore simply means for this very reason. For what very reason? What's the reason? You got to go back to the last verse. Because everything that's said in a public assembly must be said to edify everyone in attendance. That's what he was talking about in verse 12. Take a look at it again. Seek that ye may excel to the edifying of the church. For this very reason, for that reason that edification is the most important, not identification of who's spiritual and who's not. That's not the goal. Edification is the goal, and for this very reason, let him that speaks in an unknown tongue pray that he may interpret. Wow. For this very reason. Now, up until this point, Paul has been drilling down on the fact that speaking in tongues cannot benefit the hearer. Speaking in tongues cannot benefit the hearer. And speaking in tongues is supposed to benefit the hearer, but it doesn't by itself. That's the problem. It says that speaking in an unknown tongue does not edify everyone in attendance. That's the problem. He's just finished saying you must excel to the edifying of the church. Now he's turning around and saying, if you speak in an unknown tongue, it doesn't edify those who are in attendance. So he comes up with a solution. But here's most people's solution. They say, all right, you've got me convinced, Paul. Speaking in tongues is like two barbarians trying to communicate, and it's like that old movie Cool Hand Luke, where it says there is a failure of communication. And that is what's happening when there is speaking in tongues that is spoken in a public meeting. A failure to communicate is going on. So we're convinced now, Paul, speaking in tongues does not profit the hearers. Now, here's the solution of most of the churches in the whole world. And it has been the solution for most of the churches in the whole world for a very long time. You can see it up there. In order to edify everyone that's in attendance, and that's the goal, right? That's the legitimate bona fide goal, is to edify everyone in attendance. The solution is stop speaking with tongues and do more prophesying. In fact, prophesying has been defined by most churches as preaching, teaching, exhorting, and testifying. So stop speaking with tongues in your public meetings and start preaching and teaching and exhorting and testifying. Now, isn't that what has happened? Isn't that exactly the solution that everybody has come up with when they read 1 Corinthians chapter 14? Stop speaking in tongues and start prophesying. But Paul does not come up with that solution. I repeat, Paul does not come up with the solution of stop speaking with tongues and start prophesying more and more and more and more and more, to the point where it just gets to be like, aren't we done yet? I've heard enough already. Paul's solution is way different. He agrees that in order to edify everyone in attendance, now that is the goal, continue to speak with tongues. He says, do not stop speaking with tongues. Continue to speak with tongues and start interpreting what was spoken with tongues. That's what he says in this verse here. The reason why, he says, for this very reason, because edifying of everyone in attendance is the priority, for this very reason, pray that you may interpret. That's his surprising and unexpected solution. It may not be most of Christianity's solution, or Christendom, or churchianity's solution to the problem of speaking in tongues, but it is Paul's solution to the problem of speaking in tongues. He does not say speak in tongues only in private. And he does not say replace speaking in tongues with more prophecy, preaching, teaching, testimonies,